So now that we have our cluster, we can see, all right, how do we run stuff on the cluster? So first, as a kind of little thing, we can always continue to use Docker run and things like that, but that wouldn't be very interesting. But it's good to know because we can have we can mix workloads. We can still have Docker run, Docker build, Docker like all the old stuff, and right next to it we can have the new service constructs. So the first service that we are going to run, so yeah, as an easy way to map between how do I start it on Swarm, you can imagine that you replace Docker run with Docker service create. It's a really rough approximation, but just like you could do Docker run Nginx, you can do Docker service create Nginx. Just like you can do Docker run Alpine ping google.com, you can do Docker service create alpine ping google.com. And that's more or less what we're going to do here. I'm going to create a service using the Alpine image. Alpine is this tiny, super small, yet very functional base image. And I'm just going to run a ping in that container. So Docker service create alpine ping 8888. 8888 is one of Google's open DNS resolvers, and when you're very lazy like me, it's one of the easiest IP addresses to type, and usually it replies to ping, so it's a good way to test your internet connection. I do that. It immediately sends back a service ID. I can see my services with Docker service ls. So apparently somebody is also using the same machine as I am. So that's going. I'm going to use another cluster. So whomever is using those machines isn't conflicting what I'm doing. Or maybe let me double check. Yeah. Okay. So let me log out of that. All right. So I need to rebuild my cluster. So Docker Swarm init, then Docker Swarm join token manager, then for n in 2, 3, 4, 5, do SSH not $n, and this. Docker nonetheless. There we go. So it took me like 1 minute to start with a fresh cluster and recreate my 5 nodes and get back on track. I mean, we find this really interesting that it's so fast to create a cluster and that you don't have to spend hours deploying other stuff before you can start using your cluster. All right, so Docker service create alpine ping 8888. It gives me a service ID. Now I do Docker service ls. This is the service I just created. And I want to see that container now. So I'm going to do Docker service ps. I'm putting the service ID here. And it's telling me that this service is made of one task. And this task is running on that node. So I'm going to connect to that node. Well, in fact, this node is the current node, but I just want to show like how we connect to it because it could be any node of the cluster. So I'm connecting to that node. And if I do Docker ps, I see a completely normal, ordinary container. That's the container running the Alpine image and running ping 8888. And if I do Docker log on that container, I see the output of the ping 8888. So that was a really simple and boring service, but it works as a basic example. Let's have some fun and let's see what happens if I kill that container, like docker kill this. And now what happens if I check with like docker service ps? I'm going to unzoom a little bit maybe. I can see now that I see two lines. One line tells me like this is my old container, the one I just killed. And I see current state is failed and the error is task non-zero exit. And 137, this is the code indicating that the container was terminated by a signal and the signal number is 128, well rather, this is the signal number plus 128. So seek kill is 9, so 128 plus 9 is 137. So this tells me the container was killed. And as a reaction to that, SwarmKit was like, well, you wanted me to have that thing running, but it was killed for some unknown reason. So I'm just going to schedule another and replace that container. And now I have the container running on a different node.
What did you get the service number?
What did you get? Sorry?
Where did you get the service number?
Where did I get the service number? Yeah, this weird ID here. So I did. So when I started the service earlier, when I did docker service create, it did output this ID, and I can also, yeah, and I can also do docker service ls.
Okay.
And just like with container names and container IDs, I can put a prefix, like I can do docker service ps 5m1, and it's just enough for Docker to identify that service and show me information about that service. All right.
Question?
Yeah.
Why are the task IDs not the same as the container ID?
Why are the task IDs not the same as the container IDs? So this is because the task IDs are IDs of Swarm objects and they're using a different format. Like container IDs are hexadecimal identifiers and Swarm IDs are more like base 64 like. Well, it's not exactly base 64, but it's using letters and numbers. And why don't they match? Because the task is created before the container is created. There is a task that indicates we want that container to be running. But the task is created, so it has its ID, and at this point we don't know what the ID of the container will be. And remember, we can't set the ID of a container. When Docker creates the container, it gives an ID and it can be changed. So we end up with a task ID, a container ID, and they are different because each system is setting its own ID and refusing to accept a different ID. However, if I go look at that container again, so I'm going to SSH into the node that is running my replacement task, and if I do docker ps, here, I can see that my task is like dlev blah 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 blah, and I can see that the container name is ecstatic mcnulty.1.dlev. So basically, in the container name, which is something that we can set, I see the task ID. So it helps to match things together. And if I inspect my container, docker inspect for the whatever, I will have a bunch of labels somewhere. Where are they? Here. And in the labels, I have a bunch of information telling me the service ID, the service name, the node ID, the task name, so I can find all that information if I want to. Okay. So now we want to scale that service. So I'm going to do, so remember, I'm on node 1. Initially, the container was on node 1, but I killed it, so SwarmKit put the container on a different machine. So now if I look here, I don't see any container. And I'm going to ask SwarmKit to scale out my service. So docker service update. It was like, I forgot the ID again, so I'm going to check it. Docker service PS, or LS, sorry. Then Docker service update 5M16, so that's the service ID. -- replicas 10. That's it. So now if I do Docker service PS5M1, I'm going to unzoom a bit because that's not super readable. So now instead of just a couple of lines, now I see 10 instances. You can see that in the name, if you like .1, .2, 3, 4, 5, and so on and so on and so on. So now I have 10 containers running and they are all doing ping 8888. And if I do Docker PS here, I see 2 of those containers. So that's how I can scale something. And if I kill any of those containers, or if I shut down a node, basically if something happens and I don't have 10 containers anymore, then SwarmKit will immediately like, oh, you wanted 10 containers, but some of them are missing, so I'm going to create new ones for you.